Welcome to an introductory course, or should I say introductory video to a course on using Blender for creating Minetest assets. Throughout this course, I will be using Blender 3.6.1, which can be downloaded from blender.org. Will be linked down in the video description. In this first video, we are just going to pretty much be getting our feet wet with Blender. I'll teach you about the different interface, how to select objects, deselect objects, zoom in and out, pan, rotate, all of that kind of good stuff. Now, I have this set up to using the system defaults. Now, system defaults have changed over the years, and when I use Blender, actually don't use the current system defaults. I use the system defaults from several versions ago. So first thing we're going to do is actually look at the preferences and show you what things that I change. You don't necessarily have to change these, but if you don't, just know that, well, things are going to be a little bit different. So for starters, we can open the preferences by going to Edit Preferences. I'll open the Preferences window here. I am putting it to a resolution scale of 1.25 just because I am recording this on a 2K screen, and I am fearful that if I do not do that, people watching on a 1080 screen are not really going to see what's going on. So that's the reason why we're doing that. There's theming you can do. There's all kinds of impressive and fun things that Blender will let you change around. We're not going to worry about most of this. Add-ons we'll talk about later in a future video. We do have some options here. If you do not have a 3-mouse button, you can emulate the 3-mouse button by using the Alt key or the OS key, which on Windows would be the the window key, and on Mac would be, is there a Mac key? I don't know. I have a 3-button mouse, so I'm not going to worry about that. Also, if you're doing this on a laptop and you do not have a numpad, you can emulate numpad, which will let you use the number keys above your letters on the keyboard to act as the keypad. And that's useful for switching around your viewports, but we will get to that a little later. Navigation, I'm going to leave all of this stuff the same as well, I believe. Keymap, okay, so by default, Blender now uses the left key for selection. Back in the day, it used right key. So I am changing this to right key because that's what I know, and otherwise this is not going to make any sense for me, and I will be all over the place, completely lost. And we are also going to turn on tab for pie menu because I like the pie menu, and I'm going to turn on the extra shading pie menu items as well. And then we'll just come to system. Most of the stuff here you can use as whatever is listed as default. I believe it will auto recognize your GPU if you have a supported GPU. If not, here it does tell you. For these, I don't have a compatible, but I do for CUDA and optics, I guess. But if your GPU is not selected, you may want to turn that. I don't know if you'll be using any kind of rendering in this, but always good to have your GPU hooked up. Save and load. You may want to do save versions. Default, it'll do 1. So when you save a file, it'll actually save 2 files. It'll save your file as your file, and then the previous save of that file will be saved as a .blend.1, or is it .blend1? I forget. But basically, it gives you a backup. So if you were to accidentally, save a file and lose critical data because you accidentally deleted it before you saved it or something, you can go back to it. And then there's an autosave feature, which is also turned on by default, which will save in 2 minutes for a temporary save. So if Blender were to crash, there's a fairly good chance, as long as you open Blender back up and restore before you restart your OS, that you can get your files back. And then file paths. Potentially you may want to change your default path if you're dealing with a lot of textures to be someplace different than here. I'm just going to leave it as is though, and we're going to go over to the Keymap option here. So if I just tuck this off, the way Blender ships default is hitting A will select everything, and then you have to double tap A to deselect everything. It didn't used to be that way. You could just hit A again to deselect everything, and that annoys me. So we're going to change that by going to the Keymap key binding. We're just going to hit the letter A, and then I'm going to look through the list here. We have pose, and we see we have a deselect all, 3 different options, A, Alt A, and double A. I'm going to actually remove those. Oops. I'm going to go to here, open this up, and I'm going to change this to toggle. And then I'm going to do the same thing in object mode. I'm going to change that to toggle, and I'll get rid of the Alt A and the double A, and curve. Basically, I'm just going to change all of these to toggle, because having to double tap the A key is just redonkulous, in my opinion. I don't know why that was ever changed. I don't do any sculpting. Mesh, I want this changed. This is when you're in edit mode. And armature, yep, I want that one changed as well. I never use metaballs, so I won't worry about that one. Whoops. Lattice, I don't use that. Particles, we're not going to be using any particles. All right, that should be UV editor. You know what? I use the UV editor a lot, so we're going to change that. Mask editing, I don't ever use those. Okay. Node editor, you know what? We might be doing a little bit of node editing here. I don't know. So we're going to go ahead and remove those. I think that's everything we need. So then we're going to go ahead and hit Save Preferences here. Okay, now that we have the preferences squared away, let's take a look at navigating in the 3D space. So clicking and holding the middle mouse wheel will let you orbit around, which is very useful because then you can see all the sides of your objects and you see within your scene. Scrolling the middle mouse wheel will zoom in and out. Again, very useful to know. If you hold down the Shift key and then click and drag the middle mouse wheel, click and hold the middle mouse wheel while moving your mouse, you will, this is panning, right? Yeah, this is panning. If you hold Control and click with the middle mouse wheel and hold it down, you can zoom in and out. And I believe on some systems Alt will do something, but on my system that actually pulls up my window manager options. So I don't know specifically. I think that goes side by side, I think. I was going to say, I thought scrolling with the mouse wheel while holding down Shift, Control, and Alt would do that as well. But it looks like that changed at some point. So if you hold down the Alt key and scroll your mouse wheel, you'll actually move through the timeline, which when you get through animation is actually kind of neat, instead of having to use the arrow keys. Assuming that the arrow keys still work for that. Yes, they do. Okay, good. To select objects, we are going to be using the right mouse key. Now, again, it's changed now, so by default you use the left mouse key, but back in the day it was right mouse key, and that's when I learned how to use Blender, so I have just stuck with that ever since, because it would be confusing to me, but just know it could be different if you don't change it. Let's see, next let's talk about the tool menus and the object properties. I don't know why I pulled these up backwards. This is the object properties. So if I select the camera, it'll give me the location of the camera's rotation. See, I can click and drag with the left mouse key to manipulate these numbers. I can also hover over it and copy and paste with Control C and Control V. Control Z will undo, of course. So we can change that. You can also just directly enter a number into these. For that to work, you do need to click on it first. Interestingly enough, I can do 547 degrees and it won't subtract out 360's worth to make it be an actual value. Okay. And oh, and then the tools over here. Did I mention the T key opens tools and the N key opens object properties? I hope I mentioned that. We have tools here where we have some options, and we have some more options here. The 3D cursor. So the 3D cursor you can place anywhere in your scene by clicking with the left mouse key, and you'll see it's putting this little circle thing here where I'm clicking at. Well, if I want to manually set that, I can just do so. So if I wanted that at 1, oh, and its rotation's all kind of jacked up. Let me set that to 0 so it lines up right. If I want it to be at 1 unit to the right, I can just set 1 here, or I could go -1, and I can do 0. If you click and drag over numerical inputs like this, you can type in, or if you click and drag and then keep clicking without releasing the click, you can manipulate all of them at once. And now this actually gets kind of neat because I believe, yep, if they're set at 3 different values, when you do that trick, it keeps the original offsets in place. So if you wanted to, say, tweak the X and the Y value, which in the view I'm in is pointless because you can't see both of those, but you can move 2 of them and not all 3. Whatever. It is what it is. Now, because we are doing this for Minetest, there's a couple things we're going to want to know. Firstly, how big is a node in Minetest in Blender here? Like, what size is this? I don't know. Actually, I do know. And the size is 1 node by 1 node, 1 unit by 1 unit by 1 unit. Let me actually quick, because you're probably seeing the camera angles change here. Like, how is this happening? What's going on here? This is with the numpad. So if you do numpad 7, you'll get the top view. Numpad 9, you get the bottom view. Numpad 1, you get front. Numpad 3, you get right. You can toggle between orthographic and perspective with numpad 5. And then by using numpads 2, 4, 6, and 8, you can rotate. I don't know in what increments. I believe this is a value you can set. Let me put that back to perspective so it doesn't look so wonky. You can rotate around. Now say, for example, you don't want to view the front, but you want to view the back. Well, if you hold down the control key, you'll get the reverse of all of the default settings to the side views. Now, of course, because we're just looking at a square here, this doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that it tells us which view we have. We're looking at the front orthographic right now. And, oh, 0 does camera view too, by the way, in case anybody wants that. Top 7, 9 is bottom, but if you hold down control, oh wait, those 2 don't switch. That's goofy. So front is 1, control 1 is back, 3 is right, control 3 is left. And then 7 and 9 are top and bottom, and I guess those 2 won't switch for you. Oh, and then holding down control while hitting 2, 4, 6, and 8 actually pans you a little bit instead of doing the rotation. Quite interesting. And while we're talking about manipulating the 3D space here, you can also switch into quad view. And you're going to do that with Control Alt and Q. And I just did another little trick, which we may as well talk about right now too. Control Alt Spacebar will maximize or full screen your work area. So as you see here, I can still pull up my objects properties and my tools by using the T and N key, but I don't have the header, I don't have the sidebar, I don't have the timeline down on the bottom here. It's going to be very useful if you are either on a small screen or you just don't want distractions. And then Control Alt Spacebar will take you back to the previous screen here as well. All right, now let's talk about getting this cube to be the size of a default node within Minetest. So to go into edit mode, we are going to hit the tab key. And now, because I have the pie menu enabled, I'll get this nice little pie menu here, which I could hit the number 6 key on the keypad to switch to edit mode. I can hold tab down and move my mouse, and you'll see how these do show up, right? Yeah, okay. You'll see how these get highlighted. If I release tab when I am over any of these highlighted options, it'll switch me to that. So when you get really good, you can kind of just fling your cursor back and forth when you're hitting the tab key and jump back and forth between the two. Pretty slick, if I don't say so myself. But anyway, let's talk about making this half as large as it is. So we're in edit mode. We're gonna hit S on the keyboard. That does scale. And then we're gonna do 0.5 on numpad or on the normal alphanumeric keyboard. We could do 0.5. And that's going to scale this down to be half its size. We'll hit tab to go back out of edit mode, and we will see now, if we hit the G key to move this, hold down control to snap to the units increments, that it's now 1 unit by 1 unit. And if we look at a top view here and move this over by 1 unit. We can also get all that information by looking at the object properties here on the side. Again, as a reminder, N key will open that, and it gives us dimensions right here, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. Now, we actually don't want this offset like this because that's not how the exported object is going to match up. So I'm going to try to get all 3 of these. Why is this not working? There we go. Set that back to 0, so it is where we want it. I personally like to do this. You don't necessarily have to, but I like to. I'm going to lock the position on this node, and I'm going to come over here into the node outliner and click on this little filter icon, and we are going to click on the selectable icon here, and that'll give us the toggle button. So now if I click on that, it is not possible to select this cube within the 3D space. I can select it by clicking on it in the outliner here, and then if I hit the G key, I can't move it. If I hit the R key, I can't rotate it. Those aren't actually locked. I also can't scale it, even though none of these are locked. I can't interact with this object because it is not selectable. Now to change this cube so we can actually see, what we're making, because if this is representative of one node in Minetest, a decent amount of what we create is going to fit within of one node. But if we can't see it, this doesn't really help us at all. So what we want to do is come on over onto the, whatever this panel is called, I can't think of it offhand. But we're going to come to the object properties, this little orange square with 4 little corners around it. And we're going to want to scroll down. Chances are viewport display will not be opened. So we're just going to click on the little arrow little thing here. Or you can actually use the A key on the keyboard while you're hovering over it as well. And we are going to change viewport display. We're going to turn shadow off. And we're going to display as wire. So now we have this black outline of one node in Minetest. Great, we're getting places. Now we know how big we can build something while keeping it inside of one node. Or if we want to go larger, we can see that as well. However, due to the cubic nature of Minetest and the fact that most texture packs are 16 or 32 pixels, it's kind of useful to build your meshes to fit to that pixel resolution, so it kind of all looks cohesive and blends together. Well, by default, the square grid here, do you have to say square grid? Isn't a grid always square? Anyway, is 10 squares to a bigger square. It's a terrible way to describe it. But we want it not that. We probably want 16 small squares inside of one big square. If I zoom out a little bit, you can see here that we have these darker gray lines, lighter gray lines rather. And as you zoom in, the gray lines from the square inside of it become more visible and it becomes harder to tell the difference. There's still a difference right here, but you really can't tell at this point. But anyway, we don't want there to be 10, which is what there is now. We want 16. So we're going to come up into the overlays option, subdivisions, we're going to change to 16. Now, nothing happened. That's because we need to come over to the scene properties and go to the units section, which again may not be opened. Just click on the heading to open it. We want to change unit system from metric to none, which seems a bit goofy. Like, how can you have no units? Well, I don't know, but you can. They're now Blender units instead of metric. You can also use imperial, which will give you feet and inches. And you can separate units, so you can have 3 feet, 3.4 inches, or you can just have 3.28 feet. This is not helpful at all for in Minetest, but just general use. If you're designing house projects, that could be helpful. But for this case, we want it set to none. And you'll see now that subdivisions, when we change the slider here, changes the amount of squares in the grid. Again, I don't know how much any of this is really coming out through on the video, but you're going to want that set to 16. And now if you were to count it, there's 16 little squares from here to here. Cool, right? This will be represented in all of these 4 spaces here. Again, Control-Alt-Q will switch you between them. In the, what do we want to call this? In the user-defined view here, when you're scrolling around, you won't get the small grid lines. You just get the larger version. If you want to see the small ones, you do need to be in one of your side views. Also, if you are in perspective, yeah, well, it's perspective, you know, so those lines aren't really going to do you any good, but they still do show up. Just use the number 5 key to toggle, and you'll be good. All right, let's see what else do we need to talk about here. Oh, this is a useful thing to know about navigation and such. Up top here, we have different workspaces. So this is our layout workspace. I guess we should have been in the modeling workspace, right? They're really pretty much both the same thing as far as any practical purposes go. I mean, like, look at this. Layout gives us the timeline. Modeling doesn't. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Honestly, that's all that changes. It also automatically, when you toggle to the modeling workspace, whatever your selected mesh is, if it's a mesh that can be edited, it will go to edit mode. The more you know. We have a sculpting window for doing sculpting stuff. I can't select this, so I can't sculpt, but you're probably not doing a lot of sculpting in Minetest, I would guess. Well, I should say in Blender for Minetest, but get the point. UV editing, this is one that you're going to want to know about, but we'll talk about that in a future video when we're doing some UV editing. Texture painting is very similar to UV editing, but it actually lets you do your editing of your textures directly within Blender, and you can actually paint directly on the meshes as well. But we'll talk about that in a future episode as well. Shading, we'll talk about in a future episode. This is basically where you would set up your materials. A lot of that is kind of pointless for anything Minetest related because materials do not transfer through at all. We're just using basic textures, but you can actually use the system here to create textures using the material system. So we'll talk about that. Animation, if you're doing an animated mob or anything, you might want this window. It's gives you a 3D viewport, and then this is also a 3D viewport, but it has all the overlays turned off. So you don't see the grid, you don't see the if I rotate this around, wow. Well, you see the same thing the camera sees, which right now is nothing. But if we rotate this so that it's pointing at something, there, it's pointing at the cube, you don't see the cube, right? But let's add a new object, and that's Shift A, by the way, to pull up this menu. Probably shouldn't have added in an object that doesn't have visible data. There we go. You won't see any selection highlights on this. It's just exactly what the camera sees, just exactly what you would expect for an animation, because this is to see the animation, not to do the animation. You do the animation on the right half of the screen. Rendering, I've never used this tab. I don't really know what the point of it is because it just shows a render screen. Compositing, probably not going to do any of that, but it's there. Geometry nodes, don't know anything about them, so I won't be using that. And scripting, I shouldn't say I don't know anything about it, but I don't know how to do it. It uses Python. You can make Blender do stuff for you. It's probably out of scope for anything Minetest related, so we won't touch on that at all. Okay, so as a quick overview here, one thing I did want to mention. If you come over into the UV editing window, and we come up here, any 3D viewport, you're going to have to change your viewport overlays to have subdivisions set to 16, because every workspace and every 3D window is dependent of one another. So the options here do not mirror different spaces. So for example, if we come to the animation window here and we pull up the viewport overlays, this says subdivisions set to 10. This one has it set to 10. Well, let's change this one to 16 because that's what we want to be working with. And then we come check this one. This one's still set to 10 because they're independent of each other. Also, you can't see any of that stuff. The way to toggle it on off is just clicking on the button to the side here. It also has the gizmo toggle up there. Basically, any of these buttons can be clicked on. Now, interestingly enough, the snap option persists or mirrors, however you want to phrase it, between the two. And I think, yeah, that one's a global setting. So the stuff in the center is global settings. Stuff on the far right is per window, per work area setting. Yeah. So the default scene, we have set up. We have our cube here that we can't select on. That's the size of one node within Minetest. It's set up how we want it set up. The camera's probably really not how we want it set up. But honestly, you're not going to be using the 3D camera too much. So you could really just delete it by using the X key on the keyboard. Select it by right-clicking, X to delete. I'm going to actually Shift A, and I'm going to put a light back in, but I'm going to choose a sun this time. I'm going to hit the G key and just lift it up. Throw a bit of rotation on there. Again, using the numpad numbers to change my directions. So now we have a sun coming in at a bit of an angle. We're going to hit the Z key. The Z key does our shading options. So we can toggle overlays here, which makes everything invisible because none of this stuff would be visible if it were rendered. We can pull up our rendered view, which shows the overview, but we can actually toggle it and turn it off too. Material preview, well, again, there's nothing here with materials, so let's go ahead and add something just so we can see what's going on, right? I'm gonna go ahead and add the Suzanne head, and then we will toggle through to see our differences. So this is solid view. It's kind of just lit ambiently around, so you can, for the most part, see everything. You don't really have shadows on it. Wireframe, that gives you a wireframe view. So you can see directly through the mesh, although that can actually be toggled off by clicking on this little X-ray button here, or not tab, Z, you can toggle X-ray there as well. And just like with the tab pie menu, if you hit Z and then just move your mouse real quick, you can change your options here as well. So this is our rendered view. This is taking the direction the sun is coming from and using it to illuminate the object. Obviously, if you were actually working on your mesh, it's quite difficult. Let's toggle the overlay so we can see what we're doing. Like, we can see what our mesh looks like now, but it's so dark. We can't see any of the highlighting on it. It's not really optimal. Also, if you don't have a good GPU, this can get pretty laggy because you're using a lot of GPU power, comparatively speaking, to render that. Material preview. Why do I keep hitting tab? I want to hit Z. It's a little brighter than shaded, but that'll actually change depending on what your material looks like, which we'll talk about in a future video. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and move that and then delete it by hitting X and clicking delete. So we've got everything set up. We're ready to rock and roll, but we don't want to do this every time we open Blender, do we? Like, come on, it takes a while to change our viewport to 16 sub. Oh, hey, this one's set to 10. See what I mean? You don't want to be changing that every single time. That's a lot of work. Let me just make sure. Yeah, that one's set to 16. Okay, good. You know, I bet sculpting set to 10. Not that I'm going to be using sculpting, but I'm going to go ahead and turn that one to 16 as well, just in case, you know? Okay, so everything's set up. We're good to start working, but we ran out of time. So what are we going to do? Well, here's the big brain. We come down to defaults, file defaults, and then we go save startup file. Give us confirmation, and we say, yes, we want this to be our startup file. And now, every time we, I don't need to save that. Every time we open Blender, that is going to be what our default file is. So we can see here, subdivisions is set to 16. Hey, what do you know? I can't select this cube. Let's check the size of the cube. Yeah, that looks like it's about 1 by 1. Check the top view. 1 by 1 by 1. What do you know? This is what it's supposed to be. Also, my window manager. There we go. Ignore that small blip there. We now have. This video should hopefully cover the basics of Blender, kind of how to get yourself oriented, working around, and then we'll be looking at beginning modeling in the next video. So stay tuned for that.